Welcome to the Mongabay newscast. It's February 10th, 2021, and I'm your host, Mike Gorecki, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. Today we're discussing proposed solutions to the global climate crisis that could have unintended consequences and thus might not be the effective solutions they're being promoted as. Nature-based solutions to climate change involve conservation, restoration, and better management of ecosystems that remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. On a recent episode, we discussed an emerging nature-based climate solution, agroforestry, which is one of a variety of measures like reforestation and agroecology that experts say can help rein in the climate crisis naturally. But not all activities held out as climate solutions are likely to help, and some might even harm the climate. Today we're discussing a couple energy-related examples of this, biomass and hydropower. We welcome to the show Justin Catonoso, a professor of journalism at Wake Forest University and longtime correspondent for Mongabay who focuses on climate change and climate policy. Catonoso has covered the explosive growth of the biomass industry closely for Mongabay over the past several years. And he's here to tell us about the massive loophole in the European Union's Renewable Energy Directive that allows for the burning of woody biomass for energy to be counted as carbon neutral, even though it results in more emissions than burning coal. He also tells us what impact the Biden administration might have on the biomass industry.
The science on this is really clear. We have 10 years of science that spells out very clearly that the carbon neutrality of biomass does not work with the time frame that we need to address the climate crisis.
We also welcome to the show Ana Colovic Lesoska, a biologist by training who is also the founder and executive director of the Ecosfest Center for Environmental Research in North Macedonia, as well as a policy officer for WWF Adria. Colovic Lesoska was instrumental in the Save Mavrovo campaign that successfully opposed the construction of two large-scale hydropower dams in North Macedonia's Mavrovo National Park, work for which she was awarded the Goldman Environmental Prize in 2019. She's here to tell us about the thousands of new hydropower projects proposed in the Balkans region in southeastern Europe, the impacts these projects would have on the region's rivers, which are the healthiest rivers left in all of Europe, and whether or not hydropower can be a solution to climate change.
Healthy ecosystems mean healthy people. When you preserve your ecosystems and your nature, this automatically means better conditions and better livelihoods for people.
Justin Catonoso lives and teaches in North Carolina, so he's had something of a front row seat from which to watch the rise of the biomass industry over the last decade. North Carolina already has 4 plants that turn trees into the wood pellets that are then burned for energy, with a 5th on the way. That's more than any other state in the U.S. North Carolina produces an estimated 2.5 million tons of wood pellets annually, and most of those pellets are then shipped to the UK and the EU to be burned in converted coal-fired power plants. While the biomass industry is worth billions today, biomass isn't even close to being a household term, at least here in the U.S. So I asked Catonoso to start off by telling us exactly what it is.
So biomass is really any kind of organic material, and in the context in which we're talking about, organic material that can be burned or turned into something else for energy. So in the United States, we have biofuels, which is ethanol. So we grow tons and tons of corn, which we then put through a variety of chemical processes in which we come out with a liquid that we're able to burn like gasoline or mix it with gasoline and extend the amount of gasoline that we have, and it's believed to be cleaner, biofuels. What I focus on is biomass, which is actually trees, wood. These are tree trunks, tree limbs. Primarily, what we're seeing is full trees that are being cut down and taken to a new industry in the last 10 years, which is the wood pellet industry. So these are full, like long, 30-foot long trees or however long they are. They come into a mill, they get chipped, then they get dried out, and then they get put through this process that turns them into a really hard pellet. And, the average listener may be familiar with like bags of these pellets because they may have a little heater in their basement for additional heat, or they may have a barbecue that is heated by wood pellets. And all of that is fairly harmless and low scale. But what's happened to make this enormous and to make it a false climate solution is that biomass is actually being burned by the tons. And it's being burned in former coal-fired power plants instead of coal. And the reason it's being burned there is because of really an error in the 1997 Kyoto Protocol.
The Kyoto Protocol is an international treaty that extended the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which committed state parties to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
That looked at trees and biomass as a renewable energy resource. If you cut down a tree and pelletize it and burn it, and you release all the carbon that that tree had once held, as long as you plant another tree, that new tree will absorb all the carbon that came out. And so biomass got designated and defined in the same way that solar and wind is designated and defined. Zero carbon. And this has been sort of the basis for this problem. We have countries burning tons and tons and tons of wood pellets for energy. And because it's considered carbon neutral, they don't have to count the emissions, even though wood pellets create more emissions than coal used to.
So the argument by biomass proponents is that even though cutting down trees and burning them creates emissions in the short term, planting new trees means that all those emissions are sucked back out of the atmosphere. So it is, in fact, carbon neutral. What's wrong with that argument?
Well, there's actually nothing wrong with that argument as long as you have enough time. And there are studies that have been done by the Woodwell Research Institute primarily, but also a variety of scientists, really starting with Tim Searchinger from Princeton about 10 or 12 years ago, which looked at the time frame for carbon neutrality. And if you cut a tree down today and you pelletize it and you ship it across the ocean, a lot of these trees are coming from the southeastern United States, and you burn it for energy in Belgium or Denmark or the UK, which are the primary users of biomass. If you do plant a tree back in the United States, there will be carbon neutrality. It's just that the earliest that that's going to take place is 50 to 100 years. And that's if you actually plant the trees. But the fact of the matter is the Kyoto Protocol was never approved by the United States. And so tree replanting here in the United States, we're the world's leading producer of wood pellets. No one is required to replant the trees here wherever they're taking them. But even if they did, the uptake of that carbon would not take place in the time frame that we need when we're in the midst of a climate crisis. IPCC reports say...
The IPCC is the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
We need to make dramatic reductions in our carbon emissions by 2030 or face the worst effects of climate change.
And many of the countries in Europe that are using biomass for energy are actually paying power companies big subsidies to burn wood pellets, right?
They are. And it's interesting. So we can use the example of Drax, which is in the United Kingdom. So the United Kingdom has done a remarkable job. I mean, this is an economy that was founded on coal, 150 to 200 years ago. And it's practically weaned itself off coal almost entirely. So there's a lot of true renewable energy in the UK with wind and solar, but anywhere from 10 to 15% of its energy mix is biomass, is burning wood in the world's largest wood-burning energy plant, which is called Drax, which is in sort of central England. Drax is being subsidized to the tune of $1 billion a year to burn wood pellets. It has been for a long time, and these subsidies are going to last until at least 2017. And the reason for this is because in the UK and in the European Union, unlike the United States, they're mandated by law to reduce their emissions. And the quickest way that they can get to the targets that they've set is by having biomass as a part of their mix, because it's something that they can burn at scale to meet their energy demands. And they don't have to count the emissions. So on paper, Mike, they're making dramatic progress in reducing their emissions. And they've set really dramatic goals. But they're going to be wrong in their emissions by, again, anywhere from 10 to 30%, depending on how much wood you burn. In Denmark, 30% of their energy mix is wood. So on paper, they're saying we're reducing our emissions. But in actuality, the atmosphere knows the difference. we're sending more carbon into the atmosphere than if we were burning coal. And it's actually making matters worse because we don't even have the trees where they were to act as carbon sinks. So it's really kind of a double hit. We lose the carbon sequestration of the trees, and then we give up all the carbon that they held by getting, a day's worth of energy out of them.
Is there any scale at which biomass actually works as even part of a nature-based climate solution?
The best I can tell from the research that I've read, the sources that I've talked with, and the stories that I've written, when we're talking about taking down whole trees, and this is whether we're taking them from tree plantations where the wood is actually grown to be harvested and used in some way, or whether we're actually using, natural forests, there's almost no way for that to work as a climate solution. Where biomass does work is on occasion is when you're not using wood. So biomass is also, like I said, ethanol, which is less polluting than burning wood. But then you have problems in the land sector. But there's switchgrass and other kinds of organic material that grows back a lot quicker and has a shorter sort of cycle time in terms of re-sequestration that can work a little better. But you're not going to get the same scale out of switchgrass and soy and other kinds of organic materials that it's being burned for energy right now than you get out of wood. So the countries that are doing this are making the choice that makes the most sense for them to provide the energy that they need. It's just providing so much pollution. And even if we are planting the trees, again, it's just not taking up the carbon in the time frame that we need if we're going to truly address this climate crisis.
So how big is the biomass industry? How much wood is the world burning for energy right now? And besides the UK and countries in the EU, who's burning it? And what impact is the industry's rapid growth having on forests?
Right now, the primary demand for wood pellets is coming from the European Union. Almost every country in the European Union uses biomass of some sort. The UK has an enormous demand for wood pellets, but it's also growing very rapidly in Japan and also in South Korea. And so the demand for wood is increasing dramatically. In terms of the impact, I live in North Carolina. In North Carolina, we have 5 wood pellet production plants. And there's an NGO here in North Carolina called the Dogwood Alliance that tracks the industry very closely. We know, according to the company's own websites, that they're producing over 2.5 million tons of wood pellets annually to ship overseas to the EU and the UK. And it's estimated that to get 2.5 million tons of wood pellets from North Carolina, you need 60,000 acres of woodland a year. And this industry has been operating in North Carolina for 8 years now. So that starts to add up. And when you also realize that there are major wood pellet plants in Georgia, in Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, and Texas, the amount of deforestation that's taking place in the Southeast right now, according to Dana Smith, who's the executive director of the Dogwood Alliance, the deforestation in the U.S. Southeast is worse than what's taking place in the Amazon right now. That's a number that they have confirmed. I haven't confirmed it yet. It's really dramatic, but it is a story that I'm going to be working on shortly to see if that is indeed the case and report that story from Mongabay.
So whole trees are being cut down and turned into pellets. We're not talking scraps or leftovers from other forestry operations. But do we know how many of those trees are coming from plantations versus natural forests?
Those are difficult numbers to get at, and I don't have a good answer for you there, Mike. One of the things that the industry says is that they aren't using natural forests, or if they are, they're just going in and thinning, they call it forest management. And this is a really difficult thing to do. There may be some of that going on where they go in and selectively pull trees out of a forest that you can hardly tell that there are any missing. But often what's happening is that the tree harvesting is being outsourced to logging companies, and they're just going in and clear cutting. Like they are going to private landowners and they're saying, you've got 100 acres here, I'll give you X number of dollars, and they take it all. They clear cut that land and they take all that wood. They're either taking it to a paper mill, a lumber mill for building materials, or they're taking it to the pellet plants. In the Southeast, it's estimated that anywhere from 10 to 15% of harvested wood is going for biomass or wood pellets. So we're already having a problem with our tree stock going for a variety of products, and the wood pellet industry is making it worse. But it's not just the U.S. Southeast. Western Canada is a major producer of wood pellets. Eastern European countries of Latvia and Estonia they're seeing their old growth forests being decimated. And because of the demand now in Southeast Asia, we're seeing Vietnam and Cambodia also looking to supply the wood pellet industry in Japan and Korea. So again, like forested countries, this is an easy way to make money. I mean, like if they want to look at their trees as a product to sell, they'll cut them down, pelletize them, and sell them for energy to these countries that are burning it.
You've given us a sense of the scale of forest destruction in the Southeast U.S. that's fueling the biomass boom. Is the scale comparable in these other wood pellet producing regions in West Canada, Eastern Europe, and Vietnam?
So I have a sense of Western Canada. So basically British Columbia. You know, again, this is a wood producing province in Canada. And they've been, it just is so forested. It's such an enormous province that there was just for the longest period of time, they just didn't think that they would ever run out of trees. And again, those trees were being cut down primarily for lumber and for furniture and for things like that. But the wood pellet industry went into Western Canada in the last 10 years, and they've actually been taking down old growth forests. And British Columbia is down to about 1% right now of its forests that are still standing is old growth. And it's not entirely the biomass industry that's made this dent, but it's had its impact because of, again, this sort of voracious demand for wood pellets. So Canada is one of the leading producers of wood pellets right behind the U.S. I hear anecdotally from my sources in Latvia and Estonia that the clear cutting of old growth forests there is really, really dramatic, and it is having a major impact on their canopy and the quality of their forests and their ecosystems there. But I don't have a good way to quantify it right now.
In an article for Mongabay published last August, you write that current science has shown that burning the world's forests to make electricity is disastrous for biodiversity, generates more emissions than coal, and isn't carbon neutral. We've obviously touched on the latter 2 points already, but tell us about the biodiversity impacts.
This all just sort of goes hand in hand, Mike. Like here in North Carolina, when we're not cutting down tree farms, we're actually pulling trees from bottomland forests and in areas along the North Carolina coast, which right now are just filled with birds and all kinds of different animal life, everything that sort of keeps a forest, keeps it healthy, keeps it thriving. But this entire intact ecosystem is incredibly important, not only for climate mitigation and for sequestering carbon, but we are a state that is a bullseye for more and more hurricanes every year. And intact forests do a couple of things. They're sort of a windbreak for these high winds that come in, and they also are a buffer against flooding. So as we clear cut more of our bottomland forests along the coastal southeastern United States, particularly here in North Carolina, we're making ourselves more vulnerable to the accelerating climate impacts that we're having. And we are seeing that here in North Carolina, where we are having incredible flooding. We'll have storms come through here that aren't exactly strong. They're not doing a whole lot of damage from wind, but the flooding is just enormous. And that's where we're getting most of our damage in the last couple of years. And there is a connection, whether it's a 1-to-1 connection, 100% connection, there is a connection between having less and less forest, like again, losing 60,000 acres a year of forest in the eastern part of the state and having more damage from flooding from hurricanes during hurricane season. Like it's just the wrong direction to go if we're talking about making ourselves more climate resilient.
So the Kyoto Protocol sort of set the precedent of biomass burning being accounted as carbon neutral, but the more operative policy these days is obviously the EU's Renewable Energy Directive, which adopts that exact same loophole for carbon accounting of biomass. Is there pressure on the UN to change that policy, or is the EU facing calls to revise its Renewable Energy Directive?
So let's take the first question, and that is the UN doing anything? So in the last two United Nations climate summits that I covered, The last one was in 2019 in Madrid, and the year before in Poland. I specifically went there to ask questions about biomass of various countries, as well as the leadership of the UN in these climate summits. And they actually ducked the questions and refused to answer them. There isn't a single country that has stood up either in the Poland climate summit or the Madrid climate summit that stood up and said, we need to change the rules on biomass. And we need to make it so we're looking at the science and deciding whether we're actually doing the right thing, sacrificing so many forests in different parts of the world so we can burn wood instead of coal. Not a single country. It's just stunning to me, Mike. That said, at the end of the Madrid conference, one of the last press conferences was the EU. And I went to that press conference, and Frans Timmermans, who was from the Netherlands, he's one of the leaders in the EU. I asked him a question from the audience and said, one of the EU's highest priorities is accuracy in carbon accounting. And if that's the case, how do you explain the carbon neutrality designation of burning wood when all the science says that is adding emissions to the atmosphere and that it's not carbon neutral? And he paused before he answered my question, and I thought he wasn't going to answer it. And then he shocked me by saying, this is actually an issue that we need to revisit under the EU's Renewable Energy Directive. The science is changing on biomass, and we need to make sure that we are doing the right thing. And so this is an issue that we will revisit. It's the first time he ever said that, to my knowledge, and I don't know that he's said it again since. There is growing pressure within countries like the Netherlands and Denmark to push back against biomass from the green parties there and from the public. The press is starting to write about this, but it's still a very underreported subject, really, around the world. Biomass and the burning of biomass is really not known very well. I mean, I really do think like Mongabay and those of us writing these stories for Mongabay are the only ones doing it on a consistent basis. But the profile of it is starting to rise. And so there's some public pushback that's happening. And again, there's some sort of progressive Green Party pushback that's starting to happen. But no country has yet changed its policies in regards to biomass. And really the thing that would have to happen is that if it were declared, if they changed the declaration of carbon neutrality, if that one thing were to change, it would remove the incentive for these countries to be burning wood. They would have to invest in real renewables like wind and solar to hit their carbon reduction targets. But right now, wood is one of the easiest and most inexpensive things for them to do because the infrastructure is in place. They have these coal-fired power plants. They're just burning another substance. I'm reluctant to say that there's evil involved here. It's just policies that people that aren't politically strong-willed to begin with when it comes to climate change and climate policy, I mean, they're taking advantage of the policies that are in place. And until those policies change, we're going to continue to cut down trees and burn them for energy, and it's having a big impact on our planet, and the climate mitigation isn't there.
So the Biden administration has already made some strong moves around climate change, canceling the Keystone XL oil sands pipeline, for instance, and announcing that the U.S. would be rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement. Have they or might they make any moves that could impact the biomass industry?
So my most recent story for Mongabay, which is posted last Thursday, is about the new EPA administrator who is soon to be approved. His name is Michael Regan, and he's from my home state of North Carolina. He's the secretary of the Department of Environmental Quality. And I got to interview him for about a half hour in late 2019 on the issue of biomass. And he is unequivocal. Michael Regan, the soon-to-be EPA administrator in the Biden administration, believes that wood pellets are bad, that there's no future for them in the grand scheme of climate mitigation. He does not believe that they are carbon neutral. He believes that the entire industry, the harvesting, the production, the transportation, the shipping, all of that produces more emissions than any possible benefit that they could have. And it's not just his opinion. All of that has been enshrined in North Carolina policy. So while we are the while we are one of the world's largest producers, our North Carolina is one of the largest producers of wood pellets, our own Clean Energy Directive by Governor Roy Cooper, which is to get North Carolina to reduce its emissions by 70% by 2035, excludes biomass as a way of getting there. Even though the industry, which has a sizable foothold here, lobbied to be included and said, we can be a part of your climate answer. North Carolina said no, and Michael Regan signed off on that. Now, the politics of biomass in the United States are also dicey, as I explained in the story, because we have forestry states like North Carolina, like Maine, like Washington and Oregon, where the forestry industry is very powerful. We are producing biomass for export, but right now biomass is a very, very small part of our energy mix. Under the Trump administration, Scott Pruitt tried to classify biomass as carbon neutral.
Pruitt was the first administrator of the EPA under Trump.
But he didn't get to it soon enough before he was forced out, and his successor, Andrew Wheeler, never wrote the regulations for that to become a thing. So it really is going to fall to Michael Regan and his EPA whether they will enter into this political morass in our own country and do something that one says, look, we're not ever going to have a biomass industry in the United States at the scale that Europe has, because we're not going to have the same loophole that Europe has. That remains to be seen. But the EPA administrator is on record in North Carolina unequivocally and unambiguously as being opposed to this industry and saying that the science does not support carbon neutrality. So he's also going to have the support of a lot of people in government that believe the same thing. So how this all shakes out, we can't say just yet. It's not a top priority at EPA, like reducing emissions from auto and energy plants is a higher priority than biomass, but he will get to this subject probably within his first 2 years in office.
You mentioned earlier that Japan is one of the biggest growing markets for wood pellets, and I know from your reporting for Mongabay that ever since the Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011, Japan has had to essentially import all of its energy. Why are countries like Japan choosing to burn wood instead of investing in truly renewable energies like wind and solar?
For a lot of these countries, and I suspect that Japan is the same, is the infrastructure's in place. They have coal-fired power plants. And so they can immediately shift to wood and, again, take advantage of the policies that say you don't have to count the emissions. While they are also investing, so they're also investing in wind and solar. They're doing the same thing in Korea. So it's not like we're not investing in wind and solar. In fact, the majority of new investment is going into wind and solar. It's just that right now, wood pellets are having their day in the sun. In the European Union, 59% of renewable energy is biomass. 59%. It's not wind and solar. And that's where the money is going. And when they put money into that, they're not putting it into wind and solar or new nuclear technology. And again, the scientists and the advocates and the NGOs, they're screaming and yelling and advocating as loudly as they can, like, we're not going to burn our way out of the climate crisis. We're just not going to do it. And the longer we keep biomass going, the longer we are not investing in the true zero carbon energy sources that are the energy sources of the future.
The next false solution to the climate crisis we're looking at today is hydropower, which is technically a renewable energy source, if not a truly green energy source. As countries in the Balkans region of southeastern Europe seek membership in the European Union, they're obliged to meet the EU's Renewable Energy Directive, the very same law that we just heard about that allows biomass to be considered carbon neutral. The directive also requires member countries to derive a certain amount of their energy from renewable sources. So while there are already more than 1,000 hydroelectric dams in the Balkans, another 3,000 hydropower projects have either been proposed or are already under construction. Research has shown that 80% of the Balkans rivers are healthy, the highest percentage in all of Europe. But that could change if all of these projects become a reality. And what's more, 1,500 dams are proposed or being built in protected areas, 118 of them in national parks. Ana Colovic Lesoska won the Goldman Environmental Prize 2 years ago for her work that helped stop 2 large hydroelectric dams from being built in Mavrovo National Park in her home country of North Macedonia.
Just a bit of the information on the numbers. Although there are 1,000 already operating in the whole Balkan region, there are around almost 3,000 in the planning phase, around 200 which are under construction. And the most problematic issue is that 1/3 or more than 1/3 of the plant hydropower is in protected areas. This is kind of normal because protected areas are abundant in water sources, primarily because the countries from the Balkan region are lagging behind with meeting renewable energy targets, which are prescribed by the EU. They are deciding to build hydropower projects for electricity production. But this is not the only kind of stimulus behind it. Hydro energy has been a familiar technology. It has been used over the past few decades in the region, and therefore, the countries have the availability of expertise, the know-how to develop these projects. So there you have the connection, basically why these projects are being promoted. And then I would say that there is this connection between the abundance of water and the availability of technology in the region, which is, I would say, not taking advantage of the new developments in technology. And I would say that the countries have not yet invested a lot in innovation and research to be able to switch to different sources of energy production.
So the primary impetus behind the new hydropower projects is to meet the EU's renewable energy standards, but are Balkan countries also touting them as a means of meeting their climate emissions targets under the Paris Agreement, for instance?
Yes, they are. Sometimes when they're using hydro energy projects as projects which would contribute to the balancing of the water shortages, so they would rather argument that these projects are built to kind of maintain like a steady water flow or to prevent drought seasons. So they are considering them as climate solutions.
The Balkans region is indeed facing the prospect of severe water shortages and drought in the next decade, as water reserves are expected to falter due to climate change.
But we have a recent example because over the years we've had quite a lot of drought periods in the years, and when they're overusing these reservoirs, they're also using our natural lakes sometimes as sources for energy production, and it causes a serious threat to biodiversity because it just literally drains the reservoirs. And last November, our government had to make a decision to stop the production of electricity from hydropower because we just overused our artificial and natural lakes, and it caused a really serious threat to the water levels, also to biodiversity, and it looked really terrible at the same time.
The rivers in the Balkans are considered the healthiest and most free-flowing left in Europe. What threats do these hydropower dams present to healthy rivers?
There are multiple of threats to the rivers, to the biodiversity, and to the habitats in general. But we can group them in several categories. First of all, these hydropower, we're not talking about just large hydropower, but also small hydropower that basically dams a river and establishes a system of tubes and channels where the water is taken from the river, and then a dry riverbed would be left behind. So there is a large geomorphological kind of change of the whole area. There is also loss of forests. There is the impact of erosion because you would have to build access roads, which have a primary impact in terms of causing erosion because there are no measures afterwards to kind of remediate the habitats, but also a secondary impact because local people or poachers or hunters, whatever, they can access forests much easier, and then additional damage to forests and habitats can be caused by illegal logging, etc. Then in terms of the rivers themselves, like the whole integrity, the ecosystem integrity of the river is broken because you dam the river, then you have a dry riverbed. Then after the technical building or the turbines, you still have some kind of effort of the ecosystem to turn back into normality, but it just doesn't work. So in this dry riverbed, you see there is a huge drop of biodiversity. There is change in temperature, acidity of the water, and then the species cannot exist. At the same time, the riparian vegetation is also affected. And one other very important aspect of the impact from hydropower is the impact to human settlements, because more often now than ever, we see the connection between these built projects, the water intakes that have been carried out, and the loss of drinking water for settlements in the surrounding area. So especially in our country and in the region, we see much more vocal local communities against the construction of hydropower.
There can also be issues with greenhouse gas emissions from the reservoirs created by the dams, right?
It's methane, basically, from the large reservoirs. There is methane emissions that, of course, don't, they contribute to climate change.
So you founded the Ecosfest Center for Environmental Research in 2002. Tell us a bit about what led to the creation of the group and what you do.
Yeah, I mean, in the beginning, I was quite active since 1997 in different environmental groups, and in 2002, we kind of got together, establishing Ecosfest. In the beginning, I mean, the name Ecosfest means environmental consciousness, so we really wanted to raise awareness. We dealt with some waste issues and transport, etc., but over the years, it became clearer that there is this missing, like there is a gap in the environmental movement for someone that would be dealing with energy issues, because there is this huge link between the energy and environmental protection, such as the air pollution or the biodiversity loss, etc. So we kind of found our little niche there, and we are now one of the leading groups that work on energy issues connected to environment. We took part in the creation of the new energy strategy in the country, which was adopted at the end of 2019, where there is a green scenario, meaning that our country will be leading some really nice and cool processes to actually transform and to ensure energy transition toward green development. And at the same time, we had to tackle certain projects which we considered not to be in line with our vision of our country, being the sustainable and green country that we wanted to be. So we had to campaign against some of these harmful developments. Hopefully, it was successful, but there is so much more work to be done. So we have an internal joke that we can't retire ever, because there will be so much more things to be done, especially that our country has this EU perspective. So it wants to take on the European standards and improve environmental conditions and the livelihoods of people. So we still have a long way to go. But we're not giving up, of course.
Yeah, and you and Ecosfest were instrumental in the campaign to stop 2 large hydro dams from being built in Mavrovo National Park. I assume those projects are still dead, so what are you working on now?
Yeah, those projects are dead right after we managed to take out the financial support from the international financial institutions. The government changed, and then the new strategy was developed that doesn't take into consideration these dams which would be built in protected areas. So now the battle has moved a bit away from the large projects, because there are not that many left, and has moved on to the small hydropower. So what we do is we try to persuade our government now to stop the subsidies into the small hydropower projects, because they are being awarded these incentives to produce electricity from renewable sources. But actually these subsidies are the driving force behind the boom of the small hydropower literally everywhere in the country. Like you mentioned, the numbers are really huge for such a small territory. And we are trying to do that, as well as in parallel promote as much as possible the protection of our beautiful mountains and rivers and proclaiming as much more, protected areas as we can, and support the government in doing that. At the same time, we still maintain our presence in the energy sector. We try to push now for a just transition of coal regions. Of course, when you look at the energy sector, it's not just hydro. There's so much, so much more other issues that are important, and getting rid of coal is also one of the main things that we are involved in, trying to make sure that there is the local drive, the local movement, developing the just transition in our two coal regions. So we try to really do as much as possible there. And, doing that, we work a lot with experts and scientists that support us and that bring out, their findings, so we can work with arguments and data and, argument why policy change needs to take place.
Mavrovo National Park protects important habitat for the endangered Balkan lynx. As mentioned, more than 100 of the hydropower projects proposed in the Balkans are in national parks, hundreds more in protected areas. Are there more areas where threatened terrestrial wildlife would be further threatened if these projects are built?
I mean, in general, we are a biodiversity hotspot. It's not just, the fauna that has to be protected. We also have a lot of endemic species of plants and fungi that's also important when you look at the whole picture of the biodiversity. I would say that hydropower causes on one side fragmentation for the species that from the fauna that move around. We have for example, we have the brown bear. That's also an important species for which, regretfully, we still don't have a conservation action plan, but we are moving there. And at the same time, we have a lot of aquatic species, some of them not even still described in science. So the issue is that we see the problem, like, for example, the proclamation of the Shar Mountain as a national park. This is a process that's ongoing right now. Shar Mountain is just to the north of Mavrovo. This will create a beautiful, belt, green belt, for the movement of the important wild species. But at the same time, it is threatened by these hydropower for which concessions have been already issued before in the past. So we have a situation where we would like the government to cancel these concessions and agreements that they have already signed, because you can't do both. You just can't protect nature and at the same time build hydropower in our most pristine rivers and expect that the outcomes will be great. It's not going to happen. So it's either this or that. And if the country has decided that it will proclaim these areas as protected, then it should do that, because a national park is no place for hydropower. So this is basically the issue, and it's not just the Shar Mountain. There are so many other areas where we see hydropower popping up, and we managed 2 years ago to kind of mitigate the impacts of a governmental decision to issue concessions by actually pushing them to cancel some of these locations for hydropower, which were located in the current or future protected areas. We're doing our best. Of course, as I mentioned, local people are becoming more and more aware and vocal about the problems, and they're quite the allies in this case. So I really have high hopes that with this whole transition and having a brighter vision for our development as a small country, that also the government will be on our side. They've mentioned in their program that they would stop the support of hydropower in protected areas, and we will hold them accountable to that.
Do you think hydropower at any scale should be part of your country's renewable energy portfolio? Should it be considered green energy? Does it have a place amongst other solutions to the climate crisis?
Well, hydropower obviously is a renewable source of energy because, water is renewable, but it doesn't mean that it's a sustainable source of energy. And this is what we are arguing, that whatever development in the energy sector should be sustainable. And it's the same like placing wind turbines on a area which is known to be a hotspot for the migratory birds. So it cannot be sustainable if it's harming biodiversity or human settlements, etc. So in terms of the position of hydropower, this is just one portion, like the development of hydropower plants is just one way of using the source of the power of water sources. And technology has shown that there are other ways that we can use the power of water. There are so many initiatives of using, for example, the water flow in the existing water systems or in the systems of the sewage treatment plants. So there are ways that you can use the power of water. It just doesn't have to mean that you would use the water from the free-flowing rivers that are also essential for the drinking water of human settlements. So I think there is the possibility. It's just that I think societies have to also open up a bit into letting in new technological breakthroughs, which doesn't, they don't have to be really super new. It can be, they can also mimic the way hydropower was used traditionally with the windmill type. So, the options are there. I think that for our country, the solution lies mostly in solar power, because we have so many insolation days that it means, our country can really utilize the power of the sun, and the water can just be an addition to our, existing system and the balance between different sources.
You have any final words to share with us just about the importance of keeping the Balkans rivers free-flowing?
I just have one kind of like a message to everyone that healthy ecosystems mean healthy people. And for example, we've understood, especially with the COVID pandemic, that there is a strong connection between the ecosystems and people, and how you can. When you preserve your ecosystems and your nature, this automatically means better conditions and better livelihoods for people. So this awareness that we need to put so much more understanding and efforts into protecting our most pristine areas needs to grow even further. And I hope that humanity has learned at least a bit that it's very important to protect our ecosystems, which mean life, and especially water sources, which mean also life. Having the climate crisis upon us, this definitely means much, much stronger efforts on a global level, not just locally, to protect wild rivers, because, without water, there will be nothing on this planet. So hopefully we put much more effort into stopping the climate change, and this is done collectively by each and every one of us, but also collectively on the global level by governments.
If you enjoy the Mongabay newscast, we ask that you please help spread the word by telling a friend. That's the best way to help expand our reach and keep the show growing. So, for instance, if you know someone who's really interested in solutions to climate change, or really interested in debunking false solutions to climate change, this would be a great episode to send to them. Another way to help is by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. We are a nonprofit news outlet, so even just $1 or more per month would really help us offset production costs and hosting fees. Supporters at the $10 a month level also get access to our members-only insider content. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Front Line, head on over to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay newscast. That's patreon.com/Mongabay. You and your friend can subscribe to the Mongabay newscast wherever you get your podcasts from. Or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Mongabay newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. And of course, you can read all of Mongabay's news and inspiration from Nature's Front Line at mongabay.com. Or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, follow us at facebook.com/Mongabay or on Twitter and Instagram. Our handle is @Mongabay on both those platforms. Thanks as always for listening to the Mongabay newscast. I'm your host, Mike Gurecki, signing off. Talk to you again in 2 weeks.